1. China ratifies Paris Agreement ahead of G20. GS Paper 3, Environmental Impact Assessment. What is the context about? China announced that it has ratified the emissions cutting agreement reached last year in Paris, giving a big boost to efforts to bring the accord into effect by the end of this year. The United States was also expected to announce that it was formally joining the Paris Agreement in advance of the Group of 20 summit. Together, the two countries produce 38% of the world's man-made carbon dioxide emissions. Both were key to getting an agreement in Paris last year. To build momentum for a deal, they set a 2030 deadline for emissions to stop rising. Before China's announcement, 23 countries had ratified or otherwise joined the agreement, representing just 1% of global emissions. About Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris deal is the world's first comprehensive climate agreement. It will only come into force legally after it is ratified by at least 55 countries, which between them produce 55% of global carbon emissions. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are required to set national targets for reducing or reining in their greenhouse gas emissions. Those targets aren't legally binding, but countries must report on their progress and update their targets every 5 years. The first cycle begins in 2020. Only developed countries are expected to slash their emissions in absolute terms. Developing nations are encouraged to do so as their capabilities evolve over time. Objectives of Paris Climate Agreement. To keep global temperature increase well below 2°C, 3.6°F, and to pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5°C, 2.7°F. To peak greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible and achieve a balance between sources and sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. To review progress every 5 years. $100 billion a year in climate finance for developing countries by 2020, with a commitment to further finance in the future. Once the deal comes into force, countries that have ratified it have to wait for a minimum of 3 years before they exit. In the Paris Climate Deal, what are legally binding and what aren't? Legally binding targets under United Nations framework. The regular review and submission of emission reduction targets will be binding. The $100 billion fund from developed economies to help emerging and developing nations decarbonize their energy mix, which means moving away from burning fossil fuels to clean energy sources, such as renewables and nuclear. What won't be legally binding will be the emission targets. These will be determined by nations themselves. If it's not legally binding, how will it work? The emission targets are not legally binding. These will be determined by nations themselves. Within the agreement, the targets are known as Intended National Determined Contributions, INDCs. To date, 187 countries have submitted their INDCs. Observers have calculated that all of the targets, if delivered, will only curb warming by 2.7°C. This is well above, not well below, the 2.0°C goal of the Paris Agreement. Why these targets are not legally binding? This relates back to the 2009 climate summit in Copenhagen. Observers say the attempt to impose binding targets on countries then was one of the reasons why the talks failed. In Paris, a number of big emitting emerging economies, including China, India and South Africa, were unwilling to sign up to a condition that they felt could hamper their economic growth and development.